and second in intermediate and final CA examinations.
To you by Dr. Guru Prasad Murthy. Anyway, I was not going to deal with that. What I will be covering is the direct tax provisions clause by clause in detail. Indirect taxes would be just a glimpse, a few slides, and shape of things to come will be one slide. Right? Now, we are all aware of this. I'll skip this fast, but just to recap, the budget is an annual exercise preceded by a report on the state of the economy. It gives income and expenditure estimates of the government for the coming fiscal, and there are of course the tax provisions which apply for the forthcoming financial year. That is the financial year which starts from 1st April 2013 onwards. The budget itself outlines the total expenditure both on the revenue and capital account. There is two types of expenditure, plan and non-plan. The non-plan expenditure is primarily the expenditure on running the various departments and ministries and the government. So it's the plan expenditure which is the actual expenditure which goes for the various schemes and the development or otherwise. And therefore it reflects the plans of the government and industry can align itself to it. Before plunging into this, I'll just take the liberty of expressing two views because on both aspects I beg to differ, so I'll spend 2 minutes on that. The first one was by the first speaker, Dr. Surya Narayan mentioned that normally it's a post-mortem. Now I beg to differ for two reasons. First is that a budget exercise, yes, if you analyze the budget speech or talk about what the finance minister could have done, it's a post-mortem. But normally we professionals study the budget for understanding what are the implications for industry, businesses, individuals in terms of what is going to be their tax outflow or in what way they could plan their investments, which are the investments which they need to exit from. So it's actually an input for concrete work or effort. In short, you can plan your direction for the next 1 year on the basis of the budget. The second reason why I beg to differ is the same thing applies to industry also. So industry knows and investors know which are the sectors which are going to gain prominence, which are the sectors where government is keen on giving incentives and spending more money. So automatically, in fact, as the budget was being presented, you would have noticed that certain stocks started rising and certain stocks started falling, even within the overall depression of the Sensex. Why did this happen? Because investors smart enough to realize that, well, yes, there's more spend on healthcare, fine. So these companies would benefit and so therefore their stocks go up. So primarily, these are two important aspects and therefore it's not really a post-mortem. It's a lot of work to do and you have to do that work quickly because you only get a month's time hardly before the budget provisions get implemented and so they become effective. Right? Sorry, it went back for whatever reason. The second point which I beg to differ is what Dr. Murthy mentioned. He has mentioned only one aspect of the rest of what he spoke. I have no issues with. He mentioned that the finance minister has done only one thing which he could have. That is, start. Sorry for the interruption. That is being screened for the webcast. What he mentioned was there is a massive dose of investment or expenditure which the finance minister has proposed. I just want to blow that myth that yes, it is not a massive investment. I'll just quickly give you a back of the envelope calculation which I did when I was sitting there. If you look at it, last time's budget and last time's actual expenditure, which is the revised estimates, there is a fall, and not a small fall, there is a massive fall of 18%. That means whatever he had promised last time, the actual expenditure made by the government has been 18% less than that. and I'm only restricting myself to plan expenditure. I'm not considering non-plan expenditure here. So the first aspect is that there was a fall of 18% last year. You forget whether there is a fall this year. The estimates of expenditure which have been given in the budget are actually less than last year's budget estimates if you account for an inflation, a very moderate inflation of 7%. So it's a complete myth that there is a massive dose of expenditure. There has in fact been a contraction of proposed expenditure. What is the actual expenditure which the government manages may be 20% less, in which case there will be an actually fall in the expenditure compared to last year. So that's not going to work, or that is not what is the ground situation. This has happened because of a different reason. The different reason is, let me look at what has happened to the tax rates and the tax slabs. I'm just giving you an overview. We'll be going to the clause by clause a bit later. If you look at the tax breakup, and I just checked that out, individuals as well as all other entities, whether they are corporates or otherwise, who pay taxes on an income of up to 5 lakhs, comprise more than 60% of the assessees, that is 60% of the persons who pay tax, but their tax contribution is only in the region of 20%. So what he has done is, for individuals he has given a relief of 2,000 rupees, so he has lost just 2,000 on a tax base of say 5 crores. It's around 25% of the assessees, so it's around 1 crore 25, and if you multiply by that, it works out to something like 2,000 crores tax loss, hardly anything. So what he has done is, he has chosen not to expand the tax base. On the other hand, what he has done is, he has done a very limited thing. Those who have incomes above 1 crore, they constitute less than 10%, hardly 5% of the. I'm not counting only individuals who are 42,000, I'm also counting corporates here, because corporates are the real taxpayers. So if you look at all those, they are less than 5%, but they contribute more than 60% of the taxes. So what he has effectively done is, he has raised a surcharge by 5% extra, which means that he has recovered 3%. So he has planned a 3% growth in the taxes, but there is no corresponding expenditure which has happened, because the expenditure is actually less than last year. So now you know where he got his space from to play around with the budget, right? To complete where I beg to differ from the earlier speakers, essentially if you look at the private sector, drop code, why is it dropping? Is it okay? I am audible? So if you look at the private sector, you find that policy and even actions of corporates is often driven not by what is beneficial to the average shareholder or even to the promoter. Most of the professional managers take such actions that their positions are secured and their emoluments are maximized. That is well known in management theory. So a person would take those steps which would ensure that his take home is adequate and substantial. And in fact, the financial meltdown which happened, one of the reasons contributing to it was that payments were linked to results, or emoluments were linked to results. Saying that there is an election approaching, or that I have to do something which is politically convenient, may be good for the politician, may be good for retaining his seat, or may be good for the party which he represents, but is it good for the country? That is the question. In the first year after you assume term, you say that you have just come in, therefore you want to reward the people and not tax them too much or not do anything which will upset the apple cart, because this is the year of celebration. You have just joined in, let me first get my bearings and then I'll do something. Then the intermediate years you let the economy drift, and in the last year you say, now this is my last year, so I have to think of how to get re-elected and therefore I will not do anything for the country. I think if you have people like that, we need to show them the door, whoever they are, right? Okay. sorry for the strong views, but those are my views. Now we come to the clause by clause. There are only 39 amendments. Why is it not moving? Yeah. Okay. Out of which 5 are with retrospective effect. So it's not that there are no retrospective amendments. People have stopped mentioning them. Out of the 5, 3 are favorable, 2 are adverse as far as assessees are concerned. There is one amendment which is proposed from 1617 which probably may not materialize if the government changes or the finance minister changes by then. The third one, the rest is 21 amendments which are from 1415 which are prospective, but there are 12 amendments which are from 1st June, so you have very little lead time to act upon them. So the first thing is no change in the rates of tax. There is a rebate of 2,000 available up to 5 lakhs, but that is not under the rates section. There is a separate section enacted for that, so I won't discuss it here. The surcharge which goes up, I already told you that the tax impact of that would probably be that tax collections will go up by 3% overall because of that surcharge. So it is not a question of just 42,000 individuals being taxed, but there is a whole lot of corporate sector for which the surcharge has also gone up, right? Essentially for corporates, for incomes exceeding 10 crores, there is an additional surcharge of 5%. So the surcharge becomes 10% now. Similarly, in the case of foreign companies, that is non-domestic companies having income exceeding 10 crores, the surcharge goes up from 2% to 5%, that is by 3%. There is marginal relief available, so for those who just cross the 10 crore border, they could still probably pay at the lower rate of tax which they were paying earlier. In short, they will not pay tax more than the additional income above 10 crores because of the surcharge on the entire amount. The education cess and the secondary education, higher education cess continues, but there is no marginal relief for that. Let us look at the first thing, CTT. Now the commodity transaction tax which has been introduced, there are two aspects to consider here. One is it will be allowed as a deduction in computing your profits. That is some solace because your tax burden will go down. But if you look at the percentage of CTT, it is 0.01%. Are you aware what is the brokerage for commodity transactions? The brokerage is 0.01% itself. So therefore what it actually means is that the cost of doing a commodity transaction other than an agricultural commodity is going to become double of what it was earlier. So looked at as 0.01, it appears very small, but if you look at the volume of the transactions and the existing cost of doing that transaction, that cost will just double. The next one is taxation of income by way of royalty or fees for technical services. See, this has been a want, or rather this has been a knack of most finance ministers, and he continues with it irrespective of party lines. What they do is they declare a certain rate, make you enter into transactions, and after a few years, maybe 4 years, 3 years, if you are lucky after 10 years, there is a change, and that change hits everyone. Now when I entered into a royalty arrangement and I brought in technical know-how, there was a tax rate of 10% on it. Now if it suddenly becomes 25%, what am I going to do? Am I going to renegotiate the terms with the foreign party who is giving me? And it's not just the private sector alone, it is the public sector also. Maruti Udyog has a royalty arrangement where they pay a huge amount of royalty to Suzuki. Now the tax on that is going to be 25% as against 10% in the past. So what will it do to the cost of production? What it's going to do for the future is very clear. People will shy away from getting more technical know-how because getting technical know-how is going to be costlier. The overseas parties are not going to accept that 25% as a part of their cost. That will probably have to be borne by the Indian companies which are going to get that know-how. Right? So this is an issue, and well, that issue can't be solved. There is an increase, and a very substantial increase at that. It is about 150% increase in the tax burden as far as royalty is concerned. Now we come to measures to promote socio-economic growth. Why I'm going this way is, this is how the budget memorandum describes it, in the sense that those 39 amendments have been classified into various aspects. So these are for promoting socio-economic growth. Investment allowance, as Dr. Murthy mentioned, has been reintroduced. Now there are only two issues in it. The first is that if you invest more than 100 crores in new assets, only then you are eligible for an investment allowance. So it's a massive, substantial investment which will gain you an investment allowance. If it is just a minor expansion of your existing facility or some kind of rearrangement, that is not going to happen. That's the first thing. The window given for the investment is also very small. It is only a period of 2 years. Now, it remains whether in the subsequent budget that period is extended by 1 more year, because if you look at feasibility studies and then making an investment, maybe a 2-year time frame before you begin production and get the allowance, maybe cutting it a bit too fine. The third is that yes, it has been broken up into 2 years. So what would happen is that whatever you can claim in 14-15, you claim in 14-15 out of that 100 crore investment. Whatever you can't, you can claim in the subsequent year. Now the impact will definitely be positive because it will give you an additional tax shelter of 4.5% of the cost of plant and machinery in the first year, and that's the only year where you will get it. Now the difficulty would arise for companies which are already exposed to MAT because of their tax planning. In those cases, that is irrelevant for them, and so therefore that investment allowance will probably be a waste. And if you look at really large companies, most of them only pay MAT. So therefore, for them, this is small consolation. The next is the power sector has got 1 more year to implement their schemes and complete them. It was ending in 13, now it will end in 14. So 1 more year's time has been given to them to complete their projects in order to be eligible for exemption. The 2 lakh deduction, of course, is such that you get a direct deduction of 2,000 if your income is below 5 lakhs. If your income exceeds 5 lakhs, you don't get any deduction or rebate. Right? So the higher taxpayers don't get any rebate, they pay the same amount of tax. Those who pay tax less than 5 lakhs, yes, they will get a rebate of 2,000, up to. The next one is that 1 lakh additional deduction for investment in new house property and a borrowing against that. See, you already have an existing deduction of 1.5 lakhs. Now for getting this 1 lakh extra deduction, there are 2 or 3 conditions. The first is it should be a residential property. The second is that it should be a property of which the value, the loan, there is a restriction on the loan and also a restriction on the value. I can tell you what it is exactly. The restriction on the loan is that one sec. Yeah, the value of the property is 40 lakhs and the loan is 25 lakhs. Now there is an issue here. If you look at real estate prices in any of the metropolitan cities, it will be very difficult for you to look for a place which costs less than 40 lakhs. So virtually it's a dead deduction which is given. So it's a deduction which is given, people are happy about it, 1 lakh, they see the figure, there is a good impact, but I don't see any financial loss to the exchequer because of this, because there will be very few people who could actually be able to claim it. One more thing is that it is available only for 1 year. So from the next year onwards, that deduction would be restricted or it would again go less. And if you really look at it, then if you have a property of 40 lakhs and if you get a loan of 25 lakhs and this should be your first house, then if there are 2 people, 1 person can't buy. If you are looking at a really poor family or a family where both spouses work, then 25 lakhs of loan would be borrowed equally by both the spouses. So 12.5 lakhs would be the effective loan which you are taking. If you look at a 10% interest on that, the interest is 1,25,000. So it's anyway covered in the 1.5 lakh exemption which you have, which is existing. So it doesn't really go beyond that. So I don't know, probably it is a very ingenious deduction where you don't have to actually give anything, but you can announce it. So that's my take on this deduction. Okay. Then raising exemption limit for eligible premium to 15% in respect of sum assured. This is something which is very good because for persons with disability, the premium exceeds 10% of the assured amount because of the disability which they have. Now what has been done is that in case of people with disability where you need a certificate from a government recognized hospital, you will get a deduction of premium even if the premium exceeds 10% as long as it is less than 15% of the sum assured. Now CGHS, there is a 15,000 rupees deduction available to contribution to health schemes similar to CGHS. Earlier it was only available to central government health scheme. Now they discovered that even state government employees do not subscribe to CGHS. They don't fall under CGHS. Now we will have to wait and see which schemes are notified. If they are only government schemes, then in that case only government servants would get the benefit of this deduction. But if any private health schemes of non-government hospitals are also declared under this scheme, then probably other assessees or other taxpayers would also get a benefit. Now RGESS has improved because from 10 lakhs they have increased the income limit to 12 lakhs. So a much larger cross section of people can now avail of RGESS. That is the Rajiv Gandhi Equity Savings Scheme. In fact, I'll share with you something. I was speaking to an industry captain. He called me a post. I sent my budget analysis to various people. So he's also the chairman of one of the exchanges. I won't name him. So he just said, it's very nice. In fact, he has sent me an email. It's not a phone call. So although there is one thing I want to share, that I'm too tired of hearing the same Gandhi name in all the schemes. Can they not name some scheme by a different name? So that's a question which I also have. It becomes very confusing, to identify the different schemes. At least if to identify different schemes, they should have different names. Now, 100% deduction to the donation to National Children's Fund. That was earlier eligible for a 50% deduction. So now it's eligible for 100% deduction. A depository investor protection fund set up by a depository will also be exempted just like a fund set up by stock exchanges. So that's an additional exemption given. So depositories can now also set up an investor protection fund. This National Financial Holding Company, this is the amendment which is retrospective. It is there for 13-14 as well as 14-15. Its income is exempted. This is the successor company of the successor company of UTI. So income of that will be exempted. Now I have only one small grouse here. That grouse is that when UTI was encashed, was forcibly encashed because UTI crashed and so therefore people had to encash it. They were paid money out of it. They were taxed on that dividend. Then why is the shell undertaking which is surviving and which has the various assets of the erstwhile UTI exempted from taxes? I don't understand the logic. Anyway, the next one is a good one. What it says is that lower rate of tax of 15% as against 30% on dividends received from foreign companies to continue for one more year. Now this is the scheme introduced in the last budget. This is indirectly because see, voluntary disclosure schemes was the pet of the current finance minister. He used to bring one after the other. Eventually the Supreme Court in its order, because some person filed a litigation against these voluntary disclosure schemes because they were far too frequent and they were unfair to taxpayers who actually paid taxes, interest and penalties and showed their income truthfully. So what was done was the Supreme Court said that he requested the Solicitor General to file an affidavit. They said we are going to strike down this scheme. So they said, no, it's very important. Already people have contributed and made disclosures under it. So the Supreme Court asked the Solicitor General to file an affidavit saying that this will be the last voluntary disclosure scheme and there will be no further disclosure scheme under the direct tax laws. And that affidavit has been filed with the Supreme Court. So therefore there is no way in which either him or his predecessor could have brought out a voluntary disclosure scheme for getting in the money from abroad. So what have they done? The next best thing. They say if an overseas company declares a dividend, it will be taxed only at 15%. So in short, if your money is stashed away abroad, bring it into India, pay 15% tax. If you have money in India, pay 30% tax. So that scheme is extended by 1 more year. I thought I'll just give you the logic behind introducing that. So the expectation is that there will be more foreign inflows for 1 more year, but whatever comes in as dividend from monies lying overseas will be taxed in the hands of the Indian entity only at the rate of 15%. There is a removal of cascading effect. So if you have a holding company here which has a subsidiary overseas, that subsidiary declares dividend to the holding company. If the holding company declares dividend to its shareholders, it doesn't pay tax again on the foreign dividend which has come in, on which already 15% tax has been paid. So virtually it goes as a pass-through vehicle directly into the hands of the shareholders. So if individuals have stashed money abroad, it comes in as dividend, they pay tax only at 15%. It doesn't get locked up into an Indian company here. It again gets released back to the individuals. Concessional rate of tax of 5% of withholding tax on interest in case of infrastructure bonds invested by retail investors. See, earlier this exemption was available only for FIIs. That is foreign investment coming from overseas. Now they have extended it to NRIs who have NRE rupee accounts. So even for retail investors there will be only a 5% tax on the monies which are invested here. Now securitization trusts are again made pass-through vehicles. The idea behind this is that securitization will be encouraged because it's a new concept, it's coming in here but it has not caught on so much. Similarly, alternate investment funds, which is angel investors, those who are registered with SEBI under category 1, they will also get a pass-through status. That is, the income of these AIFs will not be taxed. Similarly, income of securitization trusts will not be taxed. The tax will be only when the funds are released to the owners, that is the shareholders or the stakeholders of the trusts as well as stakeholders of the alternate investment funds. STT has been rationalized and it has been reduced. So therefore, on a reduction of STT, there will be an impetus to the stock market, because see, if you see from 0.1 it has become nil, from 0.1 it has become 0.001, so substantial reduction. Now this is just to acknowledge the fall in the brokerages, because if the cost of carrying out a transaction has gone down, the tax pertaining to carrying out that transaction should also be going down. It shouldn't exceed that. So that's why it has come down. Now measures for widening the tax base. The first is the anti-avoidance measure of 1% of TDS on transfer of immovable properties. Now here again, if the consideration is more than 50 lakhs, for any transaction of immovable property, there will be a 1% TDS, and this will have to be deducted. I'll just quickly explain what the transaction means. If you sell a house property worth 50 lakhs or say 55 lakhs to take the example, the buyer will now have to deduct 1% of 55 lakhs before he makes you the payment. So 55,000 is what he will deduct, and he will pay to the government and give you a tax receipt. That is, here is your tax receipt of 55,000, and he will pay you the balance consideration. So what it indirectly means that 1% of all property transactions will be collected ab initio, not later by way of advance tax or anything of that sort or self-assessment. Ab initio, 1% will be taken out and lie with the government. Now my issue here is very simple, that if you really look at it, 90% of property transactions involve capital gains, which are only taxed at 20% at maximum, and most of these transactions involve reinvestment in house property or purchase of bonds whereby the transaction does not become taxable. So if you look at it, 90% of the transactions there will be actually no tax. So eventually that will have to be refunded. That refund will of course be without interest because it will be refunded to you in time. If you take the average time taken from the time when the money is collected, the government is going to use that money for 2 years without any interest, because it will eventually come back after 2 years. So when you introduce a TDS, it really has to be, it has to take into account ground realities, but ground realities are probably not taken into account or probably taken into account too well illegal. So therefore this is a way of collecting monies. And there are many examples like that, but I am not on that, I am on the clause by clause. For example, the unclaimed money in Provident Fund accounts and in CDS accounts is very huge. No efforts are being done by the government to try and identify the people who have kept the money in the CDS and the PF and give it back to them. In fact, they have done something else. What they have done is, from December last year, they have stopped the interest on those accounts. So in short, they say those accounts which are unclaimed will be no interest which will be given to them. So therefore, an outflow has been stopped of the government. The next one is additional income tax on distributed income by company for buyback of unlisted shares. What it actually means is that if there is a closely held company, if it declares dividend, it has to pay dividend distribution tax. That is somewhere in the region of 18%. Instead of that, corporates are allowed to buy back shares. What are the limits? Can you tell me? Rules for buyback? Rules for buyback are fairly simple. What it says is you can buy back up to 25% of the capital in terms of numbers, equity. So if you have 1 lakh equity shares, you can buy back 25,000 shares in a single year. That is the first condition. The second condition is that the paid up capital plus reserves, 25% of that it should not exceed in terms of value. So the number of shares there is a limitation, and in terms of value there is a limitation, that the money which you pay to the shareholders to buy back the shares should not exceed 25% of the paid up capital plus reserves, including share premium account. So share premium account is also added. So what it effectively means is that instead of declaring a dividend of 25% on, and that may work out to not 25%, that may work out to even 100 or 200% of the paid up capital, because you are calculating 25% of the capital plus the reserves. So it becomes a very substantially large amount. So without declaring a dividend, if you buy back the shares, money is given in the hands of the shareholders and it is not taxable as dividend. There is no tax on this. This transaction is completely tax free. You don't have to go to the court, you don't have to do anything. If the buyback is up to 10%, a simple board resolution is sufficient. If the buyback is up to 25%, you have to pass a special resolution in an extraordinary general meeting of the company. Right? And you need to get a certificate from the chartered accountant, that is the auditor, which certifies the value or the price at which the shares are being bought back. So fairly simple procedures, takes exactly 27 days. So now what are companies doing? They are scurrying. That is the proactive part. It's not a post-mortem. What are they doing? They are doing buyback for this year because they have 24 days. So from 1st March the buyback process has been set in motion and they would declare 25% of their paid up capital plus free reserves for this year, and that provision is effective from 1st June 2013. So there is another 3-month period available there. So in the next financial year again there could be a buyback. So companies which are savvy, they will do 2 buybacks, and then probably that will take care of them for a few more years till a more favorable budget provision comes back on the rule book. Okay, but there is one disturbing thing in this. What is the disturbing thing? That it de-recognizes the nature of a corporate transaction. Buying shares from an individual or a shareholder is not declaration of dividend. It's a commercial transaction. Someone is selling the share, someone else is buying it. Equating that to dividend is a big departure in terms of corporate law. So corporate law has been given a go-by in this amendment. Right? Now next is 50C extended to stock in trade and business assets. There are 2 issues here. The first is that earlier 50C was introduced. What did it say? It was just introduced I think 1 year or 2 years back. What it says is that when you sell house property, that is immovable property, it could be land or it could be buildings, any immovable property sold, if the stamp duty valuation is higher than the apparent consideration for which you sell it, the stamp duty value will be replaced or used as a deemed sale price to calculate your capital gain. To take a quick physical example, suppose I sell my house for 50 lakhs, but the stamp duty, for stamp duty purposes, the value of the house is 80 lakhs. Then in that case, and my cost of acquisition is say 40 lakhs, then normally I would have paid capital gain tax on 50 minus 40, that is 10 lakhs. But now I would pay tax on 80 lakhs, which is the valuation for stamp duty, although I have actually got only 50 lakhs. So 80 minus 40, I would pay capital gains tax on 40 lakhs. Now this provision applied only to capital gains and therefore to transactions where a capital asset was sold. Now 214 defines capital asset. What does it say? Capital asset means property of any kind held by an assessee, whether or not connected with his business or profession, but does not include first item, stock in trade, consumable stores or raw materials held for the purpose of the business. So what it actually means is that if a company sells its stock in trade, which is in the form of land or buildings, which is so in case of real estate companies or construction companies, it will not be hit by 50C because it's stock in trade and therefore not a capital asset. So 50C doesn't apply, it's business income. So whatever I have got for selling that land or the building, that minus my cost will be my profit. Now they have introduced a deemed provision 43C or 43CA. What it now means is that even in the case of a sale of stock in trade or a business asset of a company, the stamp duty valuation will be taken as the actual consideration received for calculating the business profits. Now the issue which I mentioned are twofold here. The first is that stamp duty is a ready reckoner. All premises or all properties are not the same. If you look at a large area, like if you look at this area, Chendani, then in that case there will be a single rate mentioned for Chendani. Now do you believe that all the flats or all the properties in this area have the same rate? Obviously some would be much less, some would be much more. Too bad if you happen to hold a property which is valued at less than the stamp duty valuation, you pay a tax on the difference. So that's exactly what the provision is. So in the name of simplification, it's actually inflicting some kind of a damage on people, because yes, there could be people who are undervaluing transactions and accepting money in cash, but for that, those people who actually have properties of a lesser value also have to pay the penalty. So it just poses an unfair burden on taxpayers. Now the next is taxability of immovable property received for inadequate consideration in case of individuals and HUFs. That's a typo under section 56(2). See, what has happened is, as I mentioned to you earlier, 50C imposed a tax on the difference between the selling price as per stamp duty valuation and my cost on the seller. So what is happening is, if a seller sells a property at less than the stamp duty valuation, he pays tax. But nothing used to happen to the buyer. So for example, I am a buyer, I am buying a property which for stamp duty purposes is valued at 80 lakhs and I buy it at 40 lakhs. Nothing happens to me, it's the seller who pays the tax. So now there is a provision introduced under section 56(2). What it says is that in the case of the buyer now, the difference between the stamp duty value and the price which he has actually paid, that is 40 lakhs. That will be taxed as a deemed gift, and so therefore taxed as income from other sources and taxed at 30%. Now what does it mean? There is one transaction. I sell a flat to Dr. Murthy for 40 lakhs. Its stamp duty valuation is 80 lakhs. What happens now is, on 40 lakhs, I pay capital gains, not on 10 lakhs, because my cost was 30, I sold it for 40, but the market value is 80. So I pay a tax on 40 extra, capital gain 20%, 8 lakhs, and he will pay a tax. He has bought it at 40, its market value is 80, so he will pay a tax at 30% on 40 lakhs, because it will be taxed as income from other sources, not as capital gain. So 12 lakhs. So actually on a single transaction there is a 20 lakhs tax, right? So you can imagine the extent of tax burden which has been imposed, and whether it fits in the equity of taxation also has to be seen. Because equity demands that it should be taxed only once. You are double taxing the same transaction, taxing in both hands, when actually no real money has passed hands. I'm sure, I'm not Naning Palkhiwala, but if he was alive, he would have been the first one to rush to Supreme Court in order to file a petition against this to strike down the provision. Nowadays we are also following the line of least resistance, like the finance minister is doing. So what we do is we just look the other way or find out ways and means to get out of the situation. Rationalization measures. If you want to think of what are the ways and means of getting out of the situation, then that would be an exercise in itself. This is always a good exercise for people to do. Now general anti-avoidance rules are pushed to 16. There is only one disturbing thing. They have made amendments to it which were suggested or recommended by the committees which were set up on the basis of inputs which have come in. There is only one thing which has happened, that there are three aspects rather, which are disturbing. The first is that the corporate status or entity, the veil can be lifted. So that is a departure from corporate law. That's one. The second is the form versus substance issue has been reopened. So that is the second. And the third thing is that the onus is now going to be on the taxpayer to prove that it is a genuine transaction. So it's always difficult for a person to prove that. To give you an example, probably if you expect a person who is accused of theft to prove that he has not committed the theft, it will be very difficult for him to do that. So you are kind of, if you are charging someone with something, that is the person who charges him with that who has to prove it. But here the onus has been shifted the other way. Of course this comes in 16, so we don't know. Before that there could be many more amendments, or it could be even deleted from the statute book. Now, tax on distributed income by mutual funds. This is again something I want to draw your attention to. This is listed under the rationalization measures. Now, I don't understand how increasing the dividend distribution tax from 12.5 to 25% can be a rationalization measure. What they have said is, there are different rates of taxes on distribution of dividend. On some there is 25%, on some there is 18%, on some there is 12.5%, like in the case of mutual funds. So I am increasing it uniformly to 25%. Now the rationalization could have been uniformly reducing it to 12.5% also. So it is not a rationalization measure, it is actually a tax extraction measure. Because if you look at it, see, you say okay, it's still 25, it's less than 30%. But please understand who are the beneficiaries of this mutual fund. Say there is a person who has an income of 5 lakhs who has invested in mutual funds, or a person who has income of 10 lakhs who has invested in mutual fund. He is paying tax less than 20% on effective income. Some people are paying 10%, some people are paying zero tax, some people are paying less than 20%. Now, is it fair that the distribution which comes to him also a 25% tax is deducted? So that's the issue of raising it to 25%, and it's unfair because a lot of the beneficiaries, on one hand you are saying that we are introducing RGESS, we are extending it to mutual funds, we want the small people, the common man, the middle classes to invest in all these things, shares, securities, mutual funds. And on the other hand, the distributable income of the company are recovering 25% tax, which is a tax which I would have never dreamed to pay because my maximum slab is 10% or 20%. So therefore that's again an unfair aspect which, see, one should understand this. I am not saying that okay, you take up Kajals, he has to collect money from somewhere. So the issue is not that, but when a provision comes in, you should understand the implications of it from all angles. Right. Enabling provision for facilitating electronic filing and annexureless return. Basically, as mentioned in the budget, that e-filing, e-payment, all that will be extended in a big way across the board. It will be extended to wealth tax also. Now what it means is that wealth returns were not available online for the assessing officers. Now they can cross-verify the wealth tax returns online. So that will be easier for the department to keep track of your wealth also. For example, if I say that I have given a loan to X, it will appear in my wealth tax statement. And so if in excess wealth tax statement it does not appear as a borrowing, then he is going to be questioned. Or if he has shown a loan from me and I am not showing it in my wealth, I will be questioned. So there will be a better reconciliation online. Now this is state government undertakings paying license fee to the state government. That's now not allowable as a deduction. In fact, they pay tax on it. It's not considered as a deduction. So that's a way of ensuring that the tax base of state government undertakings is not reduced. In short, they want to collect more tax from state government undertakings. It is just transfer from one arm of the government to another. This is significant because it applies a lot to areas within this region. See, 214 again, that same capital asset. So there are use of two amendments there. The first one I discussed about was the stock in trade one. Now this is the one which deals with agricultural land. See, normally agriculture is sacrosanct, so income from agriculture is not liable to income tax. It's outside the purview of income tax. Now if agricultural land is sold, obviously the capital gain arising on the sale of agricultural land is not taxable. But what has happened is a few years back, many years back, in fact maybe 15 or 20 years back, this amendment was made whereby agricultural land which is located very close to urban areas is deemed to be urban land, and so therefore the capital gain on sale of that land is liable to tax even if the land is actually used for agriculture. Okay. Now what has happened is there was a blanket kind of zone which was provided for this. Any urban area which has a population of not less than 10,000 according to the last preceding census, an area of up to 8 kilometers from the local limits of that place would be considered as a urban area, and therefore any property transaction happening there even for agricultural land would be deemed to be a taxable transaction and capital gains tax was being levied on it. Now what they realized was that this is unfair, because even if the population of a metropolis is more than 1 crore, you calculate 8 kilometers from that metropolitan city, from the local limits of the metropolitan city, and declare it as a zone. If a town has a population of 15 lakhs, then also you calculate 8 kilometers. If a town has a population of 5 lakhs, then also you calculate 8 kilometers. So they said, now there is one welcome amendment that if the population is between 10,000 to 1 lakh, so below 10,000, no issue. If any place has a population between 10,000 to 1 lakh, it becomes 2 kilometers. If it is a population from 1 lakh up to 10 lakhs, then 6 kilometers. And if it exceeds 10 lakhs, 8 kilometers. That is the zone within which agricultural transactions will be considered as property transactions and therefore liable to tax. This is just accepting the economic reality. But let me tell you one major departure which has happened here. Earlier, this applied only to municipalities. Right, that 8 kilometers. So any place which did not have a municipality, for example, there is a village which has a panchayat, but it has a population of more than 10,000, that zone of 8 kilometers was not there. Now what will happen is, if the population is more than 10,000, then that 2 kilometer zone will apply. So there is a fresh burden which has come and one has to realize this. The second thing which has happened is that now they are going to calculate not the road distance but the aerial distance, which is going to be a problem. The other day I was coming back from Nashikba road and well, there was some stone throwing on the road. So some accident and then people got agitated and in Padga everyone had come on the road. So the police diverted us much before Padga and we had to go via Murbad and come out. So those of you who have gone to Murbad will know it takes 45 minutes for the detour. The issue there is that there is a creek. On this side of the creek you have Kalyan and all that. But beyond the creek, so you can physically, actually you can see the lights. If you are in Murbad on the road, you can see the lights of the city. But it's beyond 8 kilometers because if you go by road, you have to take a big detour. There is no bridge on that. Right? Now it's 2 kilometers aerial distance. In short, the bureaucrat is going to sit there, take out a map, put his compass and calculate 2 kilometers. Whatever falls within that 2 kilometers is going to be urban area. Whatever falls in 6 kilometers or 8 kilometers is going to be urban area depending on the population. So no matter how twisted the road is and the actual road distance may be 20 kilometers, but if the aerial distance is 2 kilometers, it will be considered as an urban area. This is not fair because no one travels by air. To make it an urban area, you have to travel by road. So to my mind, it's unfair. We don't know what will happen to it eventually, but that's the law, so you have to be very careful now when you are buying or selling a land which is agricultural within that zone, right? I think I'll wrap up now. Yes, there are two more. This Keyman is one thing which I want to state, and then we come to ATG, which means the end. Keyman insurance policy, what had happened is that Keyman insurance policy is not now deductible. I mean, it's taxable, so all the use had gone, but there was an indirect benefit still available, a residual benefit. What was the residual benefit? That if before the end of the term of the Keyman insurance, the company assigned the policy to the beneficiary, the beneficiary purchased it from the company either for money or without money, then the money which the beneficiary got under the Keyman policy himself would be eligible for exemption, because it will be, that Keyman policy is still a life policy. So any money received under a life policy is not liable to tax. Now they have withdrawn that exemption. So Keyman policy maturity proceeds, even if received by the beneficiary, are liable to tax. That's a major change. The last one is about ATGGB and ATGGC. What it means is that contribution to political parties in cash will not be tax deductible. Again, this provision is made effective only from, I think it's June, I believe. I'll just check in a moment and tell you. This provision is made effective from, one sec, we have gone past GAR. No, it's the regular 14-15. That is, it is prospective from the next year. So it will apply to next year's election, no doubt. So cash contributions will not be liable to tax. This is not very critical, seized assets, etc. There is only one more thing which is important. That is, I don't know which one. One sec, here it is. Yeah, this one. Tax residency certificate. It is proposed to amend 90 and 98 to provide that submission of a tax residency certificate is a necessary but not a sufficient condition. If you remember the Vodafone case, there was a lot of fire which had been generated by this one aspect. We had discussed that here also in detail. The issue was that if you are asking me to give a tax residency certificate and I furnish it, that should be a prima facie proof. In fact, a lot of funds who route their money through Mauritius were disturbed when the government had made its intention clear that they want to tax it on the basis of the actual underlying location of the fund and not really the tax residency certificate. So they say, yes, tax residency certificate is required to claim the relief, but you also need to prove that you are a resident of Mauritius. Now they have brought it back again because it merely reiterates that earlier view. But I am so surprised at the flip-flop, because this is what is presented in the budget. And in the next day, there was an extensive meeting which the finance minister held, which was widely reported in the newspaper, with overseas investors. For 2.5 hours he chatted with them. Apparently he has promised them that tax residency certificate will be sufficient. That is what I read in the newspaper. So earlier you say it's a necessary condition and not a sufficient condition. Then you track back when the Vodafone, after the fallout of the Vodafone judgment, then you introduce an amendment in this budget and within one day you say, well, that's not going to be mandatory. So I don't know what is really on his mind, but I think I'll stop here, right? Thank you.